Imagine sitting down to dinner with your entire family, laughter filling the air, crystal glasses raised in celebration. Within an hour, every single person at that table will be dead. Not by accident, not by disease, but by a woman who'd endured 11 years of bondage and decided that one supper would rewrite history. This isn't just a story of poison and revenge, it's about secrets hidden in plain sight, a family cursed by its own cruelty, and a woman whose choices blurred the line between justice and horror. Clara of Natchez didn't just poison a plantation. She detonated its entire legacy. And the chilling twist? The children at that table may not have died at all. Before we dive deeper into Clara's story, I want to know, where are you watching from right now? Are you curled up at home, sneaking this in at work? Or maybe listening late at night when the world feels quiet? Drop your location in the comments below. And hey, if twisted histories like this keep you hooked, hit that like button and subscribe. It helps more than you know. The dining room glowed like a stage set for celebration. Candles flickered in crystal sconces, their reflections dancing across silver platters laden with roasted duck, candied yams, and a birthday cake crowned with 12 tall candles. The Whitmore family gathered around the long oak table, raising their glasses in a toast to Judge Cornelius Whitmore's 62nd year. Yet in the shadows of that polished room stood Clara, the enslaved cook whose hands had seasoned every bite. Her eyes scanned the table, her expression unreadable. Within an hour, the feast would dissolve into chaos, and the Whitmore legacy would rot alongside their untouched cake. But even in that moment, no one noticed the faint metallic tang in the air, the scent of arsenic hidden in sauces, gravies, and wine. At first, the supper unfolded like countless others. The judge boasted of cotton yields and courthouse triumphs. Margaret Whitmore scolded her grandchildren to mind their manners, while servants poured more wine. The air was thick with the scent of magnolia drifting through open windows, but beneath it lingered something darker, the slow invasion of poison. 6-year-old Emma wrinkled her nose at her vegetables, whispering, "They taste funny, grandmother." Margaret waved her off. "Nonsense! Clara's cooking is above reproach." How could they imagine that the trusted hands who kneaded their bread had also measured their deaths, spoonful by careful spoonful? The first signs were subtle. A flushed cheek here, a faltering hand there. Judge Whitmore slurred his words, attributing it to wine. But by 7:45, young Emma leaned over and vomited onto the linen tablecloth, sparking murmurs of concern. Her mother bent to comfort her, only to stagger, her own legs buckling beneath her. Panic rippled like lightning down the table. The judge clutched his throat, face purple, and collapsed into his birthday cake. "The food!" someone gasped. "We've been poisoned!" In that instant, all eyes turned toward the kitchen doorway, but Clara was already gone, her apron folded neatly on a chair. What followed was nothing short of pandemonium. Chairs scraped against the floor, bodies writhed, screams filled the air. Some clawed at their throats, others vomited violently, and still others collapsed in twitching spasms. The grand chandelier above swung gently as though mocking their convulsions. One son crawled toward the door, fingertips scraping the floorboards before his body went limp inches from escape. Margaret, gasping for breath, summoned the last of her strength to ring the silver bell for help. Its piercing chime echoed through the house, but no servants came. In the kitchen, 6 enslaved workers simply exchanged glances and kept washing dishes. They had waited their whole lives for this sound. By midnight, silence ruled the Whitmore plantation. 12 bodies lay slumped around the dinner table, a grotesque tableau of finery and death. The birthday candles had burned down to puddles of wax, untouched by flame. Outside, the Mississippi night hummed with crickets, indifferent to the carnage within. And Clara? She was already miles downriver, moving through swamp paths she'd memorized for years, carrying with her forged papers, a bundle of clothes, and a plan that stretched far beyond revenge. What history recorded was the death of a family. What history rarely admits is that it was also the birth of a legend. Long before the poisoned supper, Clara's life had already been forged in fire. Born in Louisiana, she was just 19 when the auction block stripped her name, her dignity, and worst of all, her children. Patience, only 5, and Grace, just 3, were sold off to another plantation, carried away in the arms of strangers while Clara screamed until her voice broke. That day became the wound she carried in silence, a wound that festered for 11 long years. When Judge Cornelius Whitmore purchased her in New Orleans, she was placed in his kitchen, her grief transformed into obedience, her hands reduced to tools. But grief never truly disappears. It waits, sharp as broken glass beneath silk. The Whitmore kitchen was both her prison and her sanctuary. To the judge and his family, she was invisible, a shadow moving between pots, pans, and chopping blocks. Yet in that kitchen, Clara studied everything. She learned which herbs soothed fever, which roots brought sleep, and which powders ended life. She listened when Dr. Hayes, the local physician, spoke during his visits, memorizing every careless word about dosages and symptoms. To the Whitmores, she was a cook. To herself, she was becoming something far more dangerous, a chemist of survival. Every spice jar she opened was a choice, every recipe a potential disguise for something more lethal. Over time, Clara perfected her art of invisibility. She became what the Whitmores wanted to see: silent, obedient, tireless. When guests praised the family's table, Judge Whitmore would boast, "Best cook in Adams County," as though the compliment belonged to him, not her. But Clara did not correct him. Praise was irrelevant, invisibility was survival. At night, however, when the kitchen was quiet and the coals burned low, she practiced another kind of work. Mixing small traces of rat poison into broth, she tested its bitterness, noting how much could be masked with cream or sugar. Dogs that fell ill in the yard became her unwilling experiments. Every failure brought her closer to precision. Every success brought her closer to vengeance. It wasn't only poison she cultivated. Clara built networks in whispers, friendships with other enslaved workers who understood what silence meant. She traded herbs with healers, bought rat poison with no suspicion, and collected stories from travelers who spoke of escapes, of the Underground Railroad, of lives beyond cotton fields. Beneath her apron, Clara carried not only scars, but also knowledge. The kind of knowledge the Whitmores never imagined she possessed. In a world where words were forbidden, she even taught herself to write, scratching letters in secret, creating a code only a few trusted allies could understand. Literacy was her weapon, as sharp as any knife. To outsiders, the Whitmore kitchen was a place of abundance, a room that smelled of bread, spice, and roasted meats. To Clara, it was a laboratory. Every ladle she lifted, every spoon she stirred, carried a hidden possibility. The same hands that baked sweet cakes for the Whitmore's children could just as easily end the bloodline that enslaved her. And perhaps that is what terrified Clara's captors the most, though they never knew it until it was too late, that the power to destroy them had always been simmering in their own pots, carried to the table by the woman they never even saw. On the night of the poisoning, Clara wasn't the only one who knew something was about to change. In the quarters beyond the grand house, whispers had been moving quietly for weeks, almost like a second language only the enslaved could hear. A glance shared over a wash basin, a nod exchanged in the fields, a muttered phrase that meant more than it said. Clara had never spoken aloud about her plan. Doing so would have been suicide. But silence can speak volumes. When she bought rat poison from the general store, when she stored it carefully in a gourd behind the flour sacks, others noticed. They didn't ask questions, but they didn't interfere either. Sometimes, complicity comes not from words, but from choosing not to see. When the Whitmores began convulsing at the table, the enslaved staff heard the chaos. Margaret Whitmore's silver bell clanged wildly, its shrill tone cutting through the night like a scream. 6 workers in the kitchen froze, glancing at each other as the sound echoed. One of them, Ruth, folded another linen napkin with deliberate calm. Another, Samuel the blacksmith, muttered under his breath, "Let them ring." For years they had rushed to that bell's command, scolded if they came too slowly. But that night, not a single footstep hurried to the dining room. Instead, they returned to their tasks, cleaning dishes, folding laundry, stoking fires, while their owners writhed and screamed only a few rooms away. This silent refusal wasn't cowardice. It was a rebellion born from patience and exhaustion. Each of them had stories. A whipping that left scars, a child sold without warning, a night spent praying for freedom that never came. Old Moses, who'd lost 3 fingers to the judge's temper, leaned against his cane and smiled faintly when the screams carried out to the quarters. For him, it wasn't just Clara's vengeance. It was justice long overdue, arriving not on horseback or with guns, but on porcelain plates and silver forks. And in that moment, many chose not to act, not because they didn't care, but because they understood this death was not theirs to interrupt. But silence is a dangerous form of rebellion. Some feared that if the poisoning was discovered, suspicion would fall on all of them. A young boy named Thomas stood frozen in the hallway as the judge crawled toward him, gasping for help. Thomas could have run for Dr. Hayes, the physician who lived only 3 miles away. But instead, he stood still, remembering his own sister, sold years earlier when the judge needed quick cash. Later, in his diary, Thomas confessed, "I could have fetched the doctor. Lord knows I could. But I thought of her face when they took her away, and I stayed." His silence was both his revenge and his guilt. By dawn, when the Whitmores lay lifeless, the enslaved community faced a grim question. Had they just witnessed an act of liberation, or had they all become accomplices to murder? Some argued that Clara had done what every one of them had secretly dreamed of. Others feared the consequences, that their lives, already fragile, would be shattered by retaliation. Yet the truth remained. Without a word, they had all played a part. By choosing silence, by folding napkins instead of fetching a doctor, by watching rather than intervening, they transformed Clara's plan from one woman's act into a collective reckoning. And though history would only remember Clara's name, that night belonged to all of them, Among all the Whitmores who sat at that cursed table, one detail remains clouded in rumor: the fate of little Emma. Records insist she died first, her small body overwhelmed by the poison coursing through her veins. But some witnesses, including Ruth the housemaid, whispered a different story. They claimed Clara had prepared a second mixture that night, a weaker dose meant not to kill, but to mimic death. If true, Emma may have slipped into unconsciousness while the others perished. Her death, nothing more than a calculated illusion. Could Clara, a woman who lost her own daughters to the auction block, have spared the only innocent soul at that table? The theory gained strength years later when stories emerged of a pale-faced child being smuggled away in a coffin. According to whispers passed through the quarters, one of the carpenters had built a small box the morning after the massacre. He swore it was for the burial preparations, but others claimed the box was never sealed, that it carried not a corpse, but a breathing child to a waiting wagon. The driver, a free black man trusted by the Underground Railroad, was seen leaving at dawn, his cart rattling toward the river. If the rumors are true, Emma Whitmore's story didn't end in that dining room. It began anew in hiding. Why would Clara spare her? The answer lies in her own stolen motherhood. Clara's daughters, Patience and Grace, had been sold years earlier, their faces burned into her memory. Emma was about their age, with the same restless curiosity, the same innocent defiance when scolded for not eating her vegetables. To Clara, Poisoning Emma would have been killing her own daughters all over again, but saving her, even in secret, was a way of proving that vengeance didn't have to consume every last ember of compassion. Clara's rage had a target: the adults who wielded cruelty. The children, she may have believed, were still untainted. Of course, not everyone accepted this tale. Plantation owners scoffed at the idea, insisting it was superstition meant to ease guilt. Authorities never recorded a surviving Whitmore child, and the official death count was 12. But then came a sighting in New Orleans years later. A young white woman traveling with abolitionists, introducing herself as Emma Carter, her past deliberately obscured. She carried no documents linking her to Natchez, but some who met her swore her face resembled the Whitmores' portraits. Even more suspicious, she wore around her neck a magnolia-shaped locket, the same flower that grew outside the Whitmore dining room windows. If Emma truly survived, it changes everything. It means Clara's vengeance was not blind destruction, but a calculated strike, one that preserved innocence even as it obliterated power. It means that beneath the legend of a merciless poisoner was still a mother's heart, scarred but not wholly hardened. And it means that the Whitmore name might have lived on, not through the men who enforced cruelty, but through a single girl, carried out of the house in silence, a child of both privilege and punishment. Whether fact or legend, the whispers of Emma's survival remain one of the most haunting secrets of the Natchez poisoning, proof that even in the darkest acts, humanity flickered. The Whitmore massacre wasn't just Clara's story. It belonged to every enslaved soul who bore witness that night. Long after the poison had finished its work, long after the screams turned to silence, there were eyes watching. Silent witnesses who stood in the shadows of the grand house, listening to the collapse of a dynasty that had ruled over their lives with iron hands. Some later confessed that they felt a strange mix of emotions: fear of what would come, awe at what had just happened, and a dangerous, guilty satisfaction. For once, the mighty Whitmores had no command to give, no punishment to inflict. They were writhing on the floor like any other mortal. Take Thomas, the young footman who froze in the hall while Judge Whitmore clawed his way toward him. He could have fetched the doctor. He could have called for help. Instead, he stood rooted, paralyzed not by indecision but by memory. Years later, in his diary, Thomas admitted that he had thought of his sister, sold away when the judge needed a quick profit. "I watched him crawl," Thomas wrote, "and I felt nothing but the weight of her absence." His silence, like Clara's poison, was its own form of justice. Then there was Ruth, the head housemaid. When Margaret Whitmore rang the silver bell with what breath she had left, Ruth heard it clear as day. For 15 years, she had obeyed that bell, running at its every peal, answering its call as though her life depended on it. But that night, she simply folded laundry. She later told others she had decided in that moment that her obedience died with the Whitmores. "Let them taste helplessness," she whispered to the younger servants. "Let them know what it feels like when no one comes." For Ruth, ignoring the bell was not passive. It was rebellion. Even old Moses, too frail to work the fields as he once had, became a witness. Leaning on his cane, he sat outside his cabin, listening to the commotion from the big house. Every scream, every crash of overturned furniture carried across the night air. When asked what he did while the family was dying, Moses only smiled. "I listened," he said. His 3 missing fingers told the story of his years under the judge's cruelty. To him, the sounds from the house were not horror. They were hymns of a reckoning long delayed. The truth is, Clara's poison may have killed the Whitmores, but it was the silence of dozens of enslaved men and women that sealed their fate. Had even one servant run for help, the story might have ended differently. But no one moved. No one spoke. They bore witness in stillness, and in that stillness, they chose sides. History rarely remembers their names, but that night, They became more than property. They became participants in a quiet revolution, one not fought with weapons or fire, but with folded hands and unspoken defiance. They were the invisible jury, watching justice unfold in the very house that had denied them their humanity. By dawn, word of the Whitmore family's sudden death spread across Adams County like wildfire. What neighbors first thought was food poisoning quickly turned into whispers of deliberate murder. Sheriff William Donovan, a man with a hawk's gaze and a reputation for ruthless efficiency, arrived before the bodies had even cooled. The scene was grotesque. Overturned chairs, bloodied table linens, a birthday cake sagging under the weight of the judge's corpse. "This was no accident," Donovan muttered, surveying the carnage. His eyes moved quickly to the one person missing from the household roster, Clara, the cook. And just like that, a manhunt began. Wanted posters soon littered every town square from Natchez to New Orleans. Clara's description was scrawled in black ink: Negro woman, about 30 years old, 5'4", scar on left hand from kitchen burn. A reward of $2,000 was offered, a fortune that tempted bounty hunters, slave catchers, and desperate farmers alike. Within days, riders fanned out across Mississippi, following roads, rivers, and rumors. Clara wasn't just another runaway. She was painted as a monster, a threat to the very order of plantation life. If one enslaved cook could wipe out an entire family, what might others be plotting in their kitchens? The paranoia was immediate and contagious. Sheriff Donovan's investigation soon turned up something even more chilling: Clara's journal. Hidden beneath the floorboards of her cabin, it was written in a crude code, at first appearing to be recipes. But when broken, the entries revealed dosage calculations, poison experiments, and, most disturbing of all, a list of names. The Whitmores were not the first. The Hendersons, the Beauregards, the Lancasters, all families who had suffered mysterious deaths in the past 5 years. Donovan and the county coroner, Dr. Marcus Webb, realized with horror that Clara had been moving from household to household, striking with precision. The Whitmores, it seemed, were her magnum opus, but not her beginning. The discovery rattled Mississippi's planter elite. How many other enslaved cooks might be quietly sharpening their own revenge? Meals became tense rituals of suspicion. Some families dismissed their staff entirely, choosing to eat bland food prepared by their own hands rather than risk death at supper. Others employed tasters, enslaved men forced to swallow the first bite of every dish. Kitchens, once taken for granted, were suddenly seen as battlefields. And Clara, now cast as a phantom moving through the South, became the embodiment of every master's nightmare, the servant who turns her knowledge of nourishment into a weapon. But the truth was, Clara was always one step ahead. She had studied not only poisons, but escape routes. She had allies in the Underground Railroad, forged documents, and even disguises. She lightened her skin with lye, wore fine gloves to hide her scar, and traveled under the name Sarah Coleman, a free woman of means. While bounty hunters scoured swamps and riverbanks, Clara was already vanishing into the cracks of America's cities, slipping north with the quiet determination of a woman who had planned this for years. The manhunt had begun, but chasing Clara was like chasing smoke. When Sheriff Donovan and Dr. Marcus Webb laid Clara's coded journal across the courthouse table, a terrible realization began to take shape. At first, the entries looked like chaos: scattered recipes, dosage notes, and scribbled names. But when Webb drew a line across a map of Mississippi, connecting the households where Clara had lived and the families who had mysteriously fallen ill, a chilling pattern emerged. This wasn't random. Each poisoned family was tied together through marriage, business, or blood. They weren't just slaveholders. They were the very network of families who had profited from selling Clara's daughters. Clara's vengeance was not wild rage. It was a map, a meticulous blueprint of retribution. The Hendersons had been the first. Court records showed they sold 2 young girls at the New Orleans market in 1836, the same year Clara lost patience and grace. Months later, Henderson's patriarch died of stomach fever after a dinner prepared by his new cook. No suspicion fell on Clara at the time. Enslaved women were bought and sold constantly, their histories erased with every transaction. But Clara carried her memory like a ledger. Every sale, every name was etched in her mind, and she repaid the debt in arsenic. When she was sold on to the Beauregards, they too met a mysterious end. Poisoned whiskey at a family gathering. The Lancasters were next. By the time she reached the Whitmores, Clara had already become a ghost moving through plantations, each stop another mark on her revenge map. For Donovan, the discovery was both horrifying and oddly awe-inspiring. Clara hadn't lashed out blindly. She had stalked her targets with the precision of a hunter, striking only when her plan was flawless. Webb, more sympathetic than most, noted in his private papers that Clara's methods blurred the line between grief and genius. "This was not madness," he wrote. "This was strategy." The revelation forced both men to reckon with an uncomfortable truth. Clara wasn't just an escaped slave. She was a woman waging a private war against the very families who had destroyed her own. Meanwhile, Clara herself was still moving northward, her bundle of belongings tucked close, her forged papers giving her a fragile shield of legitimacy. At night, by lamplight in safe houses, she traced her own map across the table, her finger sliding along rivers and rail lines that carried her closer to rumored freedom. Each stop wasn't only about escape, it was about hunting for information. Where had her daughters gone? Had they survived? Could she find them before the hunters found her? Every mile north was both a step toward hope and a step deeper into danger. Her revenge map was really 2 maps laid over each other, one for death, the other for reunion. But vengeance leaves footprints. Donovan's men traced her journey through old bills of sale, connecting her purchases of rat poison and her household transfers. Every plantation she'd passed through now looked suspicious, every sudden death suspect. Panic spread faster than fire across Mississippi. If Clara had done this, who else might be plotting the same? In truth, there was no one like Clara. Only she carried the names of her daughters like compass points, guiding her every step. The revenge map she followed wasn't drawn on paper, it was carved into her heart. And until it was complete, until justice was measured out in equal portions, Clara would never stop moving. The Mississippi River has always been more than water. For enslaved people, it was both a barrier and a promise, a liquid highway leading north, yet guarded by patrols and hunters. For Clara, it was the final ally in her escape. After the Whitmores' supper, while chaos consumed the mansion, she slipped into the night carrying only a small bundle, forged papers, and a vial of poison she kept for herself should capture become unavoidable. She knew the swamps like others knew scripture. 11 years of gathering herbs by moonlight had taught her every path, every route to avoid, every patch of water where the reeds hid a safe crossing. By the time riders organized a search, Clara was already far from Natchez, moving like a shadow stitched into the river's edge. Her journey north was a patchwork of danger and disguise. She rode in wagons driven by free black farmers, sheltered in barns where families whispered prayers over her, and crossed fields under skies thick with stars. Each step was part of an invisible network, the Underground Railroad, a chain of strangers bound together by the fragile thread of trust. Clara was not their first traveler, nor would she be the last, but her presence carried a dangerous weight. By then, newspapers had labeled her the Plantation poisoner. To harbor her was to risk death, yet conductors welcomed her anyway, sometimes without even asking her name. They knew what she had done, but they also knew why. Still, the river haunted her trail. At the Tennessee border, slave catchers with dogs tracked her scent to a safe house, missing her by hours. One elderly woman, Aunt Clara, faced them with trembling hands, but an unshakable voice. "I am 73 years old," she said. "I can barely walk, let alone hide a fugitive." They left, unconvinced, but unwilling to search further. In reality, Clara had already crossed a flooded stretch of swamp, her feet blistered, her scarred hand swollen from cold water. To those who later told the story, it was as though the river itself had hidden her, swallowing her trail in mud and current. The Mississippi was no longer just geography. It became her cloak. But rivers can betray as easily as they protect. By the time she reached Cincinnati, bounty hunters were closing in, their pockets fattened by the rising reward. Witnesses claimed they cornered her near the docks, the Ohio River foaming behind her like a restless beast. Some said she raised the vial to her lips, ready to choose death on her own terms. Others swore she leapt into the water, vanishing beneath its brown waves. Search parties dragged the river for days, but no body surfaced. Officials declared her drowned. Yet whispers spread like ripples. A figure seen days later near a farmhouse, a woman with a gloved hand buying herbs in a northern town. The Ohio had taken her, yes, but perhaps only into its confidence. The river's secrets became legend. For the authorities, Clara's leap was the end of her story, justice swallowed by muddy currents. But for the enslaved, the river was her rebirth. Around fires and in whispered hymns, they told their children she had outwitted not just one family, but an entire system. They said the Mississippi carried her north like a mother carrying a child, delivering her to freedom unseen. History insists Clara drowned that day. But legends insist she walked away dripping and alive, leaving the river to guard her secret. And sometimes, legends carry more truth than any official record. Years after the Ohio River swallowed her trail, a new story began to surface hundreds of miles away. In Chicago, a bustling city rebuilding itself after the Great Fire, travelers spoke of a black boarding house on State Street where the food was extraordinary and the cook wore gloves at all times. Her name, they said, was Martha Washington, a forgettable name for a woman who wanted to be forgotten. But those who looked closer noticed something strange. The way she carried herself with quiet authority, the scar glimpsed beneath her glove, and the intensity in her eyes when she taught younger women how to stir soup with precision. Some swore Martha wasn't who she claimed to be. Some swore she was Clara. The boarding house became more than a place to sleep and eat. It became a sanctuary. Runaways fresh from the South found shelter there, guided not only with warm meals but with lessons in survival. Martha taught them how to change their walk, how to lower their gaze, how to forge papers without hesitation. She trained them in secrecy the way a general trains soldiers. To outsiders, it looked like ordinary kindness. To those who knew better, it was a continuation of Clara's war, only this time, the battlefield wasn't a plantation dining room, but the streets of a northern city. She no longer poisoned bodies. She prepared minds for survival. Rumors grew darker when locals whispered about her locked cabinet of spices. Inside, it was said, she kept more than herbs. Some believed she still brewed her deadly concoctions, ready to use them if anyone threatened her or the community she protected. Once, when a slave catcher wandered into the neighborhood asking too many questions, he fell suddenly ill after a meal at a nearby tavern. Coincidence? Or the invisible hand of the woman who had once brought a plantation to its knees? People began to call her the ghost in Chicago, a woman who could kill with flavor and vanish without a trace. Yet beneath the fear and fascination, there were glimpses of tenderness. In 1868, two young women visited the boarding house, teachers from Ontario who ran a school for black children. They introduced themselves as Grace and Patience Freeman. To the boarders, they were just travelers. To Martha, they were her daughters. Witnesses later recalled how she looked at them like someone staring at a sunrise after decades of darkness. The reunion was brief, guarded, and filled with words left unsaid. But for those who believe Martha was Clara, it was proof. She had lived long enough to find the very girls for whom she had poisoned and fled. Whether Martha Washington truly was Clara of Natchez will never be proven. The records are silent, the witnesses long gone. But in Chicago, her legend lingered. Some said she died quietly in her sleep, leaving behind nothing but recipes and whispers. Others insisted she slipped away once more, vanishing into another name, another city. What remained was the impact, a generation of freed people who learned survival from a woman who had mastered it. Clara had become more than a fugitive. She had become a ghost, haunting not with chains but with knowledge, a presence felt in every kitchen where freedom was quietly seasoned into the meal. Clara's story did not end with her leap into the Ohio, nor with the whispers in Chicago. It lived on in the kitchens of the South, where white families began to eye their meals with suspicion. After the Whitmore massacre, plantation dining rooms became war zones of paranoia. Some masters forced enslaved cooks to taste each dish before serving. Others dismissed their staff entirely, preferring starvation over the possibility of betrayal. For the first time, those who claimed power realized that control could be shattered at the dinner table. The fear Clara planted was more enduring than any poison. It seeped into the rituals of daily life, a reminder that even the powerless held the power to strike. But among the enslaved, Clara's legacy was something else entirely. Around fires at night, her name was spoken like a secret hymn. Mothers told their children about the woman who dared to fight back with nothing but patience, herbs, and courage. For some, she was a monster. For others, she was a saint. Most agreed she was proof that survival could mean more than enduring. It could mean fighting. Her story spread across counties, states, even into the North, changing shape with each telling. Sometimes she drowned in the river. Sometimes she escaped to Canada. Sometimes she walked freely in Chicago. In every version, she represented possibility. Historians later tried to write Clara into neat categories: murderer, rebel, fugitive, myth. But the truth refused to fit. She was all of those things and more. She was a grieving mother, a strategist, a chemist, a teacher. She carried trauma in her body and transformed it into action, no matter how bloody. Was she right to kill 12 people at supper? Was it justice or vengeance? The questions linger, impossible to answer cleanly. What is certain is this: Clara forced the world to reckon with the humanity of the enslaved, not as silent victims, but as thinkers, planners, and actors in their own history. Generations later, the legend of Clara became a mirror. To some, it reflected fear, the terrifying idea that those beneath you might rise up. To others, it reflected hope, that no system of oppression could choke out resistance forever. Even today, in hushed southern towns, people still whisper about the Whitmore poisoning, as though speaking her name might summon the scent of magnolia and metal that haunted that dining room. Clara is remembered not just for what she destroyed, but for what she revealed. That justice sometimes comes not in courtrooms, but in kitchens, carried on silver spoons. In the end, Clara's legacy is both poison and cure. Her acts were brutal, but they broke a silence that had lasted too long. They showed that the powerless were never truly powerless. Somewhere between history and legend, between the river that swallowed her and the kitchens that remembered her, Clara lives on. Maybe as Martha Washington in Chicago, maybe as a ghost in northern towns, or maybe simply in the stories passed down. And every time those stories are told, every time a candle flickers over a table, the question remains: was Clara a monster, or was she a mother who loved her children enough to become one?